Hello everyone. In this lesson we're going to take a look at the scientific process. So this is our introduction to the scientific method, experimentation, and what the purpose of science really is. Now the purpose of science is of course to understand or advance the knowledge of our world. And we do that through experiments, we do that through observation, we do that with questions, and we try to figure out answers to those questions based on the information we have and the observations we've made. And we want to do that in an ordered and repeatable way so that we can share results and others can confirm them or ask more questions about them. So experiments, controlled experiments, are how we discover a lot of new information. And sometimes the purpose of an experiment is to test a hypothesis, but sometimes it's to make more observations. If it's a brand new thing, we won't necessarily have a hypothesis yet. We just want to know what happens if. So sometimes we design an experiment with a hypothesis in mind. Sometimes we design an experiment simply to make more observations. If we have a hypothesis, that's a testable, refutable statement. That means we can show it to be wrong. Can be shown to be false. That's what it means. It's refutable. That describes the relationship between variables. Now, variables are things that can change, hence vary, right? And so we're going to have to pick which variables we're interested in when we develop a hypothesis and want to test it. So a variable is something we can manipulate, measure, or control in the experiment. And those all mean different things, right? So manipulate means you're going to change it on purpose. Measure means you're going to see if it is affected, and control means you're going to prevent it from changing. So experiments are often designed for that cause and effect. If I do this, then this will happen. So we find the cause and effect relationship between the manipulated and responding variables. The one you change is called the manipulated variable. We also call it the independent variable because it doesn't depend on anything. It's the one you get to pick. Now, the variable you measure to see if it is affected is the responding variable because it changes in response to what you did. It's also called the dependent variable because it depends on the independent variable. So the responding variable is what you're asking a question about. What happens to this if I do this, right? So the things you're investigating. There are many variables in most experiments, but you're only worried about a couple of them. So the rest of those, you're going to prevent them from changing. And that's what we mean to say they're controlled. We prevent them from changing. And even if you're doing an experiment where you're just answering the question, what happens if, you're only going to change that one thing. You're only going to manipulate one thing. You might not know how anything's going to respond, but you still only want to have that one change. So you're going to control the remainder of the variables. So we call those controlled variables, and they're fixed. Now, if you are going to do an experiment with a hypothesis, your hypothesis needs to be in the correct form. It's a prediction about what's going to happen, and it explicitly mentions what you're going to change and what it's going to affect, what you're going to manipulate, and how the responding variable is going to respond. So we write it as an if-then statement. If I do this, then this will happen. Now, sometimes we don't have a good idea of what's going to happen, and that's okay. So then it's more of a what happens if. But if you're writing the hypothesis, if I change the manipulated variable, then the dependent variable will. Now this right here, this change, you should tell me what that change is going to be. So if you're going to make something hotter, if you're going to make something longer, if you're going to make something more massive, if you're going to drop it from a higher distance, whatever it is, whatever the change is, tell me what it is. Don't just say change. And then tell me how the dependent variable will respond. The hypothesis, like I said, has to be testable, so you can't write a hypothesis that you can't test. It needs to be refutable. That means it has to be able to be shown to be wrong, which goes with testable. A hypothesis is generally not proven correct. It's supported or not, but there's always one more thing to change, so or one more thing to look at. So we can strengthen a hypothesis, and we can develop laws, and we can develop theories. We'll look at those later. But that hypothesis is answering the question you're investigating through or should answer the question you're investigating through experimentation. So if the question you're trying to answer is what affects plant growth, then your hypothesis should tell me if I do this, then plant growth will be affected like this. So what you're going to do when you design your experiment is determine what question you're trying to answer. You're going to then identify the variables that you can manipulate, measure, and control. You're going to write a specific hypothesis that answers the question you're investigating, or write a what happens if question. Then to develop a plan to test your hypothesis, and then you put that in motion and you measure all those variables you need to measure. So for example, if I start with what affects how quickly grass grows, there's lots of different things that there could be that affect that, but what I'm interested in, what I want to see is what's affected is how quickly grass grows, right? So this right here, that is the responding variable. Now, manipulated variables, there's all kinds of them. If I wanted a manipulated variable, I could talk about sunlight, I could talk about fertilizing, I could talk about watering, I could talk about how much time it's exposed to sunlight, what colors of light it's getting to, what kind of soil it's in. There's all kinds of manipulated variables. Once I've done that, then I'm going to just pick one of those and write a hypothesis for it, because I can only write a hypothesis for one variable at a time. So we're going to change the one manipulated variable and then measure the responding variable and control everything else. So if I picked a whole bunch of variables, all of these, I can only pick one of them to test at a time. So I might pick the amount of light, and I could say if the amount of light if the amount of light the grass is exposed to increases, then the grass will grow more quickly. We could do something like that.